Hello, and thank you so much for joining me for Scripture Unleashed. Happy Mother's Day to all of the wonderful mothers out there and all of the wonderful mother figures. Somebody is watching you. Today, we will be looking at the book of Genesis, chapter 38, and we will be reviewing verses 6 through 19. I've entitled today's lesson, A Right to Give Birth. This is a story about Tamar. I'm reading from the New Living Translation of the Bible, and it reads as follows. Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the child would not be his, so whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from providing offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death also. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, live as a widow in your father's household until my son Sheila grows up. For he thought he may die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's household. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah, to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend Hira the Adullamite went with him. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance to Enim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that though Sheila had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, come now, let me sleep with you. And what will you give me to sleep with you? She asked. I'll send you a young goat from my flock, he said. Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it? She asked. He said, what pledge should I give you? Your seal in its cord and the staff in your hand, she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. Amen. Let me start by giving a little background about Tamar and why I've chosen her as our focus for today. Tamar, in my opinion, is one of the first women in the Bible to fight for her civil rights. Tamar was a single mother. Tamar was also a woman of honor, though if you think about what we have just read, she does not sound like it. For this reason, I'd like to tell her story. Also because she is one of the pillars for the genealogy of Christ. There are two other places in Scripture where Tamar is mentioned outside of Genesis chapter 38. She is mentioned in the book of Ruth, chapter 4, verse 12, where Ruth is being praised as being like Tamar in giving birth to her sons. They considered her blessed and favored like Tamar. Again, she is mentioned in the book of Matthew, chapter 1, verse 3, where she is highlighted as part of the genealogy of Christ. I like to talk about her. I talk about her every chance I get because I believe she is one of the most misunderstood women in the Bible. And for this reason, she doesn't often get highlighted. But I bring her up particularly on Mother's Day because the right that she was fighting for was the right to give birth. She was being denied a right to give birth. And when we think about now in the 21st century, we do definitely still have a ways to go when it comes to women's rights. And we often still find ourselves fighting for reproductive rights. But definitely in biblical history, in ancient times, women had even less control over their body and their right to reproduce. So she was very dependent on the society around her to exercise that right in a way that protected her legacy and her future. And she valued that right so much so that she took some very unorthodox steps to secure her rights and to secure her legacy. And so I find her especially interesting, and I like to tell her story because she is one of those ancient mothers who fought hard and really risked her life just for the opportunity to give birth. And so for this reason, I want to pay special focus to her today. The other thing is I can't really talk about Tamar without also talking about Judah. Tamar gave birth to two sons, and their father was Judah. And without getting into a whole lot of explanation about it, we can talk about it another time. We understand that we are part of the lineage of the tribe of Judah. So I can't really talk about Tamar without also at least giving you a little tidbit about Judah. Judah was one of Jacob's 12 sons. And as many of you may know the story, Jacob was in love with a woman named Rachel, who he later married. But before he was able to marry his true love, he was tricked into marrying her sister Leah. And Leah had many sons for Jacob. And Jacob, because of the way he felt about Leah, really resented Leah and resented her sons, and it caused a lot of dysfunction in the family, because for a long time Rachel couldn't have children, though he was in love with Rachel. Leah kept having children, and he hated one after another. And so finally, when Rachel does have children, she has two, and she dies during childbirth. He is especially attached to those two boys that Rachel had. Judah was not one of those two boys. And that led to a lot of problems, a lot of fighting among the brothers and the siblings. And I think some of us, even though we're in the 21st century, may understand some of that dynamic, how sometimes that relationship between a mother and father can turn very negative for the children of those parents, especially if the parents can't work through their issues. So because of that dysfunction, many of us are familiar with Joseph. And there's a story where the brothers, Joseph's stepbrothers, throw him into a pit and eventually sell him into slavery. Judah was a part of that. And Judah was able to get the brothers not to kill Joseph, take him out the pit and sell him into slavery, which seemed like a better idea than killing him at the time. But as we know, that was a very horrible experience. But shortly after that, Judah took a break from the family and he decides to leave town. And I share this because this story is a break in that story. This story doesn't stand alone. This story shows Judah, after this experience of meeting Tamar and having been humbled by the experience, he's able to go back to his family and make things right. But that doesn't happen until he has this encounter with Tamar. And I share this because many times in an ideal world, everybody will get along very well and people get married, have children, live happily ever after. But every now and then you will run into some dysfunction. And sometimes in that, we want to get rid of people that God may have planted in our life to fulfill his ultimate plan. And that's what we see here with the meeting of Judah and Tamar. This was not a plan they had, but it was God's providence. And God's providence was fulfilled in a very unorthodox way. And so I want to give you that background. So as we just read, Judah had some sons and it was time for them to get married. And so he's now not living among his own people. And so he finds a Canaanite woman. And that woman that he finds to marry one of his sons is Tamar. And so she is not an Israelite. It turns out, if you'll read again through that the oldest son that was ready to be married first and was given to Tamar was a very wicked man. It doesn't say exactly what he did that was so wicked, but he was so wicked that the Lord killed him. The law at that time, civil law at that time, required that the brother, the next kin, marry, if he's of age, the widow of his brother. Didn't matter if he loved her or not. It was a way of securing that widow's future, was that he would have children with her, and that child would be heir to whatever the brother's estate would be, because at that time women didn't generally own property, because in many ways women did not have many civil rights. And so a man needed to own things. And so it would be left to his son. And so that was always a hope that whenever women would give birth, they would give birth to sons. Well, the brother, Onan, marries Tamar, and he sleeps with Tamar. but he puts her in a position where she can't give birth. He wants to have the benefits of sleeping with her, but he doesn't want her to have the benefits of producing children with him. And so he practices his own form of birth control. The Lord sees it. The Lord kills him. Well, now Tamar has 2 dead husbands. And though nobody said anything, they did not blame God. Deep down, they blamed Tamar. And they felt that Tamar was evil and there was something wrong with her, or those 2 sons would not have been killed or died the way they did. And it doesn't say exactly how, it just says that the Lord killed them. Well, there was a 3rd son, but he was not old enough to be married. His name was Sheila. And Sheila was not of age to be married. And so Judah, because he didn't want Tamar around, tells her to go back to her father's house. Technically, she should not have had to go back to her father's house because she was now part of his household, but he didn't want her around. She was supposed to go back to her father's house to wait until the last son was of age to marry, and then he would marry her. Turns out, though, that when the youngest son became of age, Judah didn't want to let him go. And so he left Tamar to spend her life in her father's house without the opportunity to give birth and secure her future and to redeem her reputation. So that is what is happening here. So that's what's happening from verse 6 through 11. Okay, so now let's go to verse 12. It says, after a long time, we don't know exactly how long, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. And it says, after Judah recovers from his grief, if you continue reading from verse 12, he goes up to a place called Timnah, which was near where Tamar lived with her father. And that was where he had men who sheared his sheep. And he had a friend there named Hira, who was an Adullamite, who went with him. And while he was there, Tamar was told, basically, your father-in-law is on his way. And so she took off her widow's clothes because there was a certain attire that she would wear to show that she was a widow, and covered herself with a veil, it says, to disguise herself. And then she sat down at the entrance to Enam, which is on the road to Timnah. This is in verse 13. It says, for she saw that though Sheila had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. So she wanted to be married. She wanted to have children a certain way, and she wanted to be in a healthy relationship. But because of the laws in place at that time, she was totally dependent on her father-in-law to make that happen. And he'd made up his mind he was not going to do that. So it says when Judah saw her, the father-in-law, he thought she was a prostitute. Says, for she had covered her face. Says, not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, come now, let me sleep with you. So they go back and forth because she says, well, what are you going to give me to sleep with me? She recognizes now that he does not know who she is. He says, I'll send you a young goat from my flock. And she says, well, can you give me something as a pledge until you send it? I need some kind of collateral so that you don't get what you want from me and leave me without what I need to get from you. So he asks her, what pledge should I give you in verse 18? She says, your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand, she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, it says she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. So that's the part that we just read. And there are a few things that I want us to take from this. Sometimes you are due something, or you have a right to something, but there are others who don't respect your rights. Let me say that again. Sometimes, even though we have rights, and there are certain rights that are due us, there are some people who do not respect our rights. And that's what we see here with Tamar. In an ideal world, people will do what is right. They'll give you what belongs to you. Or you can ask for it and they'll willingly cooperate so that you can have what you're supposed to have. Unfortunately, there are times when people just don't do the right thing. And this was the case with Judah. Now, Tamar had a choice. She could sit and wait and be really noble and be a martyr and say, eventually, God will fix it and everything will be fine and Judah will have a change of heart. That is not what happened. And it turns out that she decided that she was not going to be noble and that she was not going to be a martyr, that she wanted what was her right to have now. I think many of us can understand and have been in situations sometimes where you would like to really take the high road. But we live in a world where people don't always do the right thing. And so sometimes, even though we don't want to go to court, we may have to go to court to get what belongs to us. We may have to get other people involved, maybe go to somebody superior to make things right. Sometimes God will intercede on our behalf and we don't have to do anything. And then there are other times where we may have to take some steps on our own to make things right. Knowing when that is and how to do that is an individual decision that everybody needs to make for themselves. It turns out that in Tamar's case, she felt that she did what she had to do. And so she was supposed to marry Judah's youngest son. But she had an opportunity to still have her offspring from the household that owes her the opportunity to give birth to offspring through Judah. Ideally, Sheila would have done it. But the next best thing was her father-in-law, who was no longer married. And so she took the opportunity to give birth. And it sounds really crude for a 21st century audience, but when you look at it from the culture at that time, one of the men in that house had a responsibility to willingly and in an honorable way honor her and take care of her and produce a child with her so that she would have a future. None of the men chose to be honorable, from her first two husbands that the Lord killed, and even her father-in-law and Sheila, his son. So she did what she felt that she needed to do. Again, my point is that though you may have rights, it does not mean all the time that people will respect your rights. This brings me to my next point. Sometimes we do have to take what belongs to us by force. I look right now at some of the things that are happening even now in our society. It's no secret that racism is a very is a very big part of the culture here in the United States. We've heard even recently of just some of the injustices against young Black men and even young Black women and just people of color in general in this country. There are laws that help protect people who may oppress us or abuse us. And if we think about even our history as people of color in this country, many times laws have had to be challenged in an effort to make sure true justice takes place. Because man's law and God's law don't always reconcile. The good news here is that Tamar was not punished. I say that because if you continue reading, Judah finds out that Tamar is pregnant. He does not realize that he is the person who got her pregnant. What he hoped was this would be an opportunity to get rid of her. And so, though stoning would have been more appropriate, he asked that she be burned to death. And he calls her out and makes a big stink, makes it very public that she's pregnant, and basically asks that she be killed. It happened that she kept the items that he gave her as a pledge. And so when they came to kill her, she defended herself by saying that this is the father of these children. And it turned out that it was Judah. Now, Judah clearly had a lot of power. And this is where we see a change of heart. Judah, I believe, had enough power, because we can see even in our own country here in the United States that sometimes just because something's right doesn't mean that it's always acknowledged and that justice will take place. But in this case, he was able to admit that he was wrong. And when he realized that he was the father of the children that she ends up carrying, because she has twins, he admits his wrongdoing. And I want to point that out for two reasons, because as I mentioned to you earlier, Judah's mother is Leah. I think sometimes we meet people in life who help us work through issues that we may be dealing with. Judah had a lot of anger, and things really weren't going that well for him. Though he may have accumulated some wealth and influence, he had two sons and a wife pass away, and he was very scared for his youngest son. He didn't have much of a legacy that he created in running away from his family. And he gets into the situation, but I believe that he was supposed to meet Tamar. Tamar was more honorable than he was, but I dare say maybe he thought about his own mother and how Jacob didn't want her and how Jacob didn't want those children because he didn't like Leah. And hopefully he could see that he was doing the very same thing to Tamar, that this was a woman that he did not want for his sons or for his family. But she was the woman God chose to use to bring the righteous seed into the world. He never married Tamar, but he did take care of those children, which is why I say she is a single mother. Just because she's a single mother does not mean that she is not due honor. I know that sometimes in our society, particularly in the Christian community, single mothers are kind of snubbed. We don't talk about it, but it's a real thing. We don't know why a woman may be single and raising children by herself. I dare say most women wouldn't prefer it to be that way. But sometimes there are circumstances that arise that make it what it is, because we do not live in a perfect world. And those women are due honor like any other mother. Those children are due honor like any other child. And so I want to share her story because there are a lot of people who, when we think about godly women and honorable women and mothers, definitely don't think of a person like Tamar. But I dare say that in our 21st century society, there are a lot more Tamars than there are Hannahs and Marys and some of the other more popular women in the Bible. And I do think it's beautiful that God's inspired word makes sure that Tamar gets an honorable mention at least 3 times. Here in Genesis chapter 38, in Ruth chapter 4, and in Matthew chapter 1, God does not want her to feel like she is forgotten because of her circumstances. So I close with this final thought, and that is God will take care of us, and he will fight on our behalf. God will take care of us, and he will fight on our behalf. I entitled this message, A Right to Give Birth. And even if you don't have children, we all have a desire to be productive, to have a legacy, to feel that we have a destiny. And sometimes there are people who will try to stand in the way of that. And I want to say to you that sometimes as you make whatever decision you feel like you need to make to secure your future, to protect your legacy, to get to your destiny, that we just need to trust God and do the best we can with the circumstances that we find ourselves faced with at the time. For some people, that it may be very disturbing to hear me say what I'm saying. There are times when you have to do what you have to do with what you have. I am not encouraging anything immoral, unethical, illegal. What I am saying is that we do not live in a perfect world. And sometimes in our effort to get from A to B to C, we don't always know what to do. And so we do the best we can with what we have. In this case, I dare say Tamar was not punished. Tamar was honored. Tamar was blessed. Because Tamar valued the gift of life that she was given and the gift of life that God entrusted to her through her 2 sons. There are a lot of single mothers who do a lot of different things to put food on the table, to make sure bills are paid. Right now, we are in the middle of a crisis, a national crisis. And there are people who feel very desperate right now because bills are due. They're hungry. They have things that they need, and nobody seems to be able to fix it for them. Unemployment benefits aren't being paid. Loans aren't given to the small business for one reason or another. And they still need to eat. They still need to feed children and make sure a roof is over their head, keep the lights on. And though there are laws saying that you're not supposed to be evicted, not everybody does the right thing. And sometimes people just don't know what else to do except the best they can. They may choose to wait on a miracle, and others may choose not to. I say that because there's a lot of unrest in the country right now, and it's leading to a lot of dysfunction in the community. What I challenge us to do is look at each other, respect each other's humanity. I want to encourage those in particular who are making the decisions that they need to make to take care of themselves and their family because they value their life. And some may feel that they're making a bad decision. I want to encourage you today that only God has the right to judge your decisions. My challenge to you is to just make sure that you've talked to God about the decisions that you're making and trust Him to carry you through and to hold your hand through what may be a very difficult time. Again, I share this story not to make you feel a certain kind of way or tell you what to think, but I share this story because I think Tamar is a person who may provide inspiration for those who may not find that they are in a perfect situation right now. That they will look at her situation, and maybe find some sense of relatability. I do believe that the Bible has all kinds of people in it, many of whom do make up the final role in that Lamb's Book of Life, who don't dot all their I's and cross all their T's perfectly. And somehow God provides for them. He takes care of them and He keeps them in the family of Christ, which is the main point. Tamar, whatever you may think of her, is one of our mothers of the faith. And that is why she's given a place of honor. Because she was a woman who, it is implied, had faith in God to make things right, even if she participated in her own liberation. Again, a right to give birth. Happy Mother's Day. God bless you.